Hello and welcome to Natsukashii, the old anime podcast. Today I'm joined by Caribou Coon, or Shaves,
How do you do?
Kamimashita,
Hello.
and we're going to be discussing. Oh, and I myself, I'm Core of Core Reviews, and today we're going to be discussing Area 88. It's based off of the long-running manga of the same name, and we're discussing the OVAs today. It aired February 5th, 1985 to June 15th, 1986. And a general plot synopsis is that the story follows Shin Kazama as he gets tricked into flying for the remote country Aslan, and he can only escape this place by either working there for 3 years or killing enough enemy fighters that he can earn the money to buy his way out. So that's the initial premise, but there's of course a lot more to the film. So does anyone want to jump in with some initial thoughts?
Yeah, I wanted to mention that it's such an important OVA to the medium itself because it came so early. Like the first OVA being in 1984 with Dalos. This comes out a year after Dalos with in 1985 in 3 installments. Though I think when I first watched it, like the second and third installment were kind of like stitched together a little bit, weirdly enough. And then we should also mention that there was a TV series that came out in 2008. Is that it? What year was that? It was in the definitely like the late 2000s. I want to
It
say
came out in 2004.
Oh, 2004. Okay. Yeah, so it was a full core TV series, a lot longer, but from what I hear, a lot blander. I think what's really great about this OVA is just how gritty and gorgeous it is in terms of the planes and the level attention to detail and all the backgrounds and characters. Just everything about it is just very aesthetic and gritty and awesome looking.
Yeah, it is amazingly, like, really impressively well animated, especially when you look at when it came out. And I haven't seen the TV show myself, but from what I've heard, despite the fact that it aired over a decade after the OVA, most people consider it far inferior to the OVA when it comes to the visuals. And like it's really nice to look back because nowadays it's pretty much everything when it comes to like cars and planes is done with CG for good reason because it's much easier. But I definitely miss this older aesthetic where we had these complex mechanisms drawn by hand. It's got a very unique look to it that can't really be replicated with computers.
Definitely. I mean, the explosions alone are gorgeous and they're all hand drawn, and it's one of the best parts of the show for me.
Yeah, and particularly I like especially when they're flying the planes, they use a very high contrast. The blacks are like almost pure black. Really contributes to the intensity of the scenes.
Yeah.
I'm curious. Oh, go.
Well,
You have something to say?
well, I was just going to talk about the cinematography in general being pretty
Yeah.
outstanding. Yeah. I mean, it shifts between so many perspectives. They'll do like a wide angle shot and then they'll like transition into like a first person. It just really adds to, the eclecticness and the like hecticness of everything without resorting to like shaky cam.
Definitely,
Yeah.
it's very competently directed. I think that you get that with a lot of older stuff. They don't have a lot of it's not as flashy. It's very because this is just me projecting and thinking and cell animation and everything. The way that like cell animation is working in this, the camera has to be very still, and they have to have a lot of wide shots. They can't really do a lot of tricky, fun things at the time. So a lot of it is very planned and meditated and looks great. I think it's incredibly well shot and put together in that way.
Yeah, and interestingly, I would say the it's really well directed, but not done so in a way that draws attention to itself. It does a good job of servicing the narrative.
Yeah, that's a very good
Even
point. That's a very good point to make.
Yeah, even in the times where the visuals do get a little more out there, um, it's never sort of like you don't get the feeling, and I got this feeling a bit like with uh, Chojin Lock, the first film we talked about. Um, I never feel like they're just doing like, okay, maybe not never, occasionally, but for the most part, I don't feel like they are like just throwing in cool effects because they can. Though there definitely is a bit of like, this plane is cool, look at it, but I think that's just part of the appeal of it in the first place. I'm curious as to what you guys thought of the main character, Kazuma. Um,
He used to be, when I watched this a while ago, it was one of the first things I watched actually, not like very first, but like when I was really getting into the medium and like, all right, what's considered like the best stuff, I found that this was only 3 episodes and very well regarded. So I watched it fairly early on before like a lot of well-known stuff, before a lot of other stuff, and I really admired Kazuma because he was a protagonist that I hadn't experienced really in anime, where he is very aggressive and he's well, okay, he is like a leading man guy, and he used to be like a pretty affectionate and well-meaning dude, but because he gets tricked into this whole mess and has to steel himself and get really intense, he becomes that kind of character that is very aggressive and like really intense, I think. And I don't know, there's something really interesting about that. It's not a lot of protagonists that are able to do that.
Like I never saw him as aggressive really, but more like I mean, it's definitely true what you said about him having to distance himself. He almost like kind of tries to let go of what he was previously to try to make it so that his time in Aslan is easier. And he kind of has these like barriers set up that are like part of his moral code. Kind of like how he stops the other guy from shooting he tries to tell the other guy not to shoot the guy in the sky who's parachuting down, who's escaped, even though he's still like murdering people regardless. Like I think it's an interesting dynamic there where he knows that what he's doing is wrong, and he's trying to reconcile that within himself.
yeah, and you can definitely see, because he does sort of like at first have this, the stoicism that is common in these sort of like cool main protagonist characters who are like they're like the leader of the team, or they're the best at what they do, and they're very stoic and they don't show a lot of emotion, and that's how he seems at first and how he behaves around other people. But then you have the scenes where he's alone in his room and he just sort of breaks down as like, I can't do it anymore, I can't do it. It's like you can see how it's like really tearing him apart.
Oh yeah, he he feels very tortured about the whole thing, um, and doesn't let other people see it really because it would show a sign of weakness for him for other pilots, I think, because he has to make himself, in order to get out earlier, he has to build a reputation for himself, and he can't be seen as this like pretty boy tragic figure. He just has to be like this badass, I think.
It's interesting how it touches on a little bit on the political climate around the events, but it never really highlights a particular side as being all that great. I mean, the particular squad he's serving on Area 88 is specifically with the purpose of just they are there to be paid. They're not there because of any type of loyalty to their country, and that's a theme that sort of goes on, is this sort of like honorable loyalty to one's own country that is lacking in their actions, like particularly when uh, the the other Japanese soldier signs up, but then almost immediately after tries to run away, and is caught. And he sort of like he asks to speak with Kazuma, and he sort of berates him for his coldness and his ability to kill other people. And he was like, if you were serving on behalf of Japan, you know, it would be one thing, but this is just killing for no reason.
Yeah, I think he's a good contrast and good foil. Because, you know, like when Kazuma gets brought there initially, the only thing he can think about is, this is how I get back. You know, I have to kill these people if I raise this much money. And then the other guy shows him that there was another choice. You could just, like, he basically says that he can never bring himself to kill anybody regardless. So he would rather die by firing squad. Which is an important thing for Kazuma to look at, I think.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I feel like that wasn't, like they didn't go as in depth into that sort of idea as I would have liked. Especially since he shows up, I think, in the third act. So, pretty late in the
Like, he
trilogy.
could have been a more pivotal character and more important to the story, but he shows up a little too late to really cause any impact.
One thing I thought was kind of interesting. Well, first off, is the sort of is this a word, frivolity? Frivolousness.
Frivolity, I guess.
That the show sort of handles the death of our main characters. Like, they introduce a lot of the squad of Area 88, and their relationships with Kazuma in particular, and some of them are on fairly good terms with him and seem like, you know, solid supporting characters, pretty prominent ones. But when they die within the show, there's always this, it sort of like emphasizes this theme of like, this is just how it is, because once they die, there's never any big like mourning sequence or anything like that. It's just they move on to the next mission. Even the case where the camera guy, who's introduced in the first episode, like, he seemed like he was going to be like a pretty pivotal character, especially with how he was like so focused on Kazuma, but he like dies and then he's just gone. It was just really interesting, the approach the show takes to death.
Yeah, it's really poignant, I think, too. I mean, obviously the show has a lot to say about war, but it always made me a little amused, maybe in like a morbid way, when like there's that one final mission they're doing, and they have to go through that ravine, and at the end of it, they're just like, okay, who's left? How many people we have left? We have 6? Sure, let's go on. And, you know, they don't even mention it, because, you know, it's really not that important at that moment. But then even when they get back, they don't really, like, you know, no one holds a funeral or anything.
Yeah, they don't have time to.
Mm-hmm.
And they like when they think back on it, they're like, "Oh, I hardly knew the guy. Like, I kind of knew him in this particular
Warn him,
context."
I hardly knew him.
Right. And it's like, you know, it actually kind of I had watched this before, Legend of the Galactic Heroes, and Legend of the Galactic Heroes is a lot like that, where a character that will be built for a while just suddenly gets killed in one episode, and you don't even expect it, and none of the characters expect it, and it just happens. And it's just kind of like, I think it speaks to how immediate death can be in these situations, that it's just that close, you know? And I think that just brings it closer to the realism of this show, of this series as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in some ways it's kind of a little bit, I don't know if poetic's the right word, but I mean, even if you look at the case, particularly of Mickey, who's like a very um, pivotal character for the whole thing because of the way he is so similar to Kazuma in a lot of ways. He's in a essentially he is Kazuma except just further along in development. He's undergone he's been through the stages that we will see Kazuma go through later on, and he sort of sort of amplifies the sort of the whole culture of these people, which is that yeah, they are broken people who cannot find any way to live except by going out and getting the thrill of risking their lives and killing other people.
Definitely, definitely. I wanted to. I just had this one on my mind just now, and it's a bit of a segue, but just going back a bit to the visuals, I was just noticing the character designs for this are awesome. I think they have such a great detail in the hair and the facial structures and everything, and I do appreciate also that they're pretty realistic body proportions, especially when they're in like the planes. Like they kind of give an extra level of detail. But yeah, there's just something so retro about Kazuma's hair in particular, with just just half of his head is just covered in hair. You
Yeah.
know, it's just it's just like this slop of hair on the side, and it's just so cool looking. Um, yeah.
I'll have to say I slightly disagree. Mainly just for Kazuma. Like he's the only character design that I'm not really a big fan of in the show, and it's mainly his hair. And
Yeah.
it's not necessarily the fact that it's like big, but it's mostly that it's like it's inconsistent
Oh
because
yeah.
if you pay attention, they like designed it so that the hair, you know how it curves and covers like half his face.
Hmm.
Right.
It does that from every angle, which doesn't make any sense. So in certain shots, it just looks like he has like regular long hair, and in other shots, it looks like his hair is like defying the laws of gravity in a really bizarre way. It was at this point that my computer crashed for seemingly no reason whatsoever, so I'll be absent for a little bit, but will return. Apologies for the technical difficulties. Please enjoy the rest of the podcast.
That's fair. That's understandable.
It does look really badass though, like you mentioned when he's in like the cockpit and has like the face mask on.
Oh, absolutely. Oh man,
I really like those cockpit shots.
definitely. And speaking of the cockpit shots, and then just generally, I think that it's. I think I've already touched on this kind of, but like the level of detail they put into the planes themselves, and the accuracy in depicting these machines and all of the different stuff like that. It kind of speaks to that level of authenticity and detail that you see in something like Gunsmith Cats, where they would like go to Chicago specifically to like take pictures of all the different locations and look at the real cars and the real guns and all that.
Uh
Um,
huh.
it's stuff like that that kind of it shows that you put care into these OVAs and stuff like that, which I think is one of the charms of having this being an OVA rather than a TV series.
Exactly. Like I mean, just the level of detail they put into even like the dogfights and choreographing everything. That must have been insane.
Oh yeah, definitely. Especially you think of that first shot. Even like if anyone hasn't seen this yet and then just wanted to like peek at, if you just look at the first scene, there's just this dogfight against like this tank, and ew, what this came out in '85.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Like it doesn't really feel dated in a sense. Like obviously the art style is like you can immediately tell it's old. Um okay. Uh and even the use of like insert songs as well. Like some of the music in here was so great and it matched so perfectly, but it's all 80s songs.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's cool though. I mean, especially with like that's the time it takes place in, and so I think all of that combines together to feel like it was really a period. It was of that time. It was an OVA made in the '80s from like a '80s or '70s manga. It's a story that takes place pretty much in the '80s, I would say. Like it's probably in that same time frame. So it's kind of like a time capsule in that way.
Yeah, yeah, like it's like a slice of the 80s presented to you in OVA form.
Yeah, yeah. It's sick. Sick. Um Man, I have to say the bad guy, like kind of just the overall bad guy of Hansaki, I think his name is. Is that right?
Yeah, it's Kanzaki.
Kanzaki. Oh my gosh. I it's impressive. Sometimes you're like how can a series really make me hate a guy? Sometimes the bad guys in some shows you're like, I mean, yeah, he's the bad guy, but I don't hate him. The characters hate him, but I don't really think he's all that like what he's the bad guy, I guess. But this one it's you really hate this guy. This guy is a real scumbag.
I mean, like in a sense, I kind of think that makes him a slightly bad character.
You think
Just
so?
because, like, I mean, like, so like he's like obviously evil, and he does have his own motivations, but his motivations tend to boil down to like, Cosmo's always been better than me. I want the girl. I want the prestige.
Yeah. It's very
Like,
yeah, it's very simplistic in that way.
yeah, exactly. That's what I was going for.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's not just the character itself, how he's written that you have to pay attention to, but just how everyone else sees him. Especially with you really end up being sympathetic to Kazuma and what he's, how he trusted this guy, and what his perspective was, and it's like, what the hell, I think you get it in his corner so much that like I believe it as much as he does in terms of he's just like, fuck that guy.
Yeah.
That's just
I mean,
me,
especially with the Ryoko thing,
yeah.
and that's just like scumbaggery to the utmost extreme.
Yeah, yeah. Oh man. Hey, so like jumping another thing. There was one scene that I still remember. This fight scene that they have where they're trying to land like there's this like carrier plane or no, like a passenger commercial airline or something, and he has to, I don't remember, it was like shooting down the engines but just not to make it crash or something.
Yeah, no. So there's a portion where they're trying to assassinate Saki, so they put bombs on the bottom of the two wings of the plane. So they had to figure a way to shoot them off, but their tail wings would have been in the way if they tried to fly under it close enough. So they have to do this like crazy stunt where they fly upside down and shoot them off that way.
Yeah, right. So like I just remember that having so much impact on me, just because like I was, when I was first watching it, I was like, all right, so I'm gonna be watching this mainly for how good the animation is and how the cool flight and everything and good cinematography and all that. But this was the time where I was like, oh, this is actually some really interesting strategy or just an interesting scenario that they put in front of you, and not just like, oh, it looks cool. And that's just me personally, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean I agree. Like it's weird to use this phrasing, but it's almost episodic in a way because they have different missions that they go on, and each mission provides a different problem that they have to solve.
Hello, I'm back.
Hi.
Hello.
So what were you guys talking about?
So
while I was gone?
me and Shapes were talking about how we first talked a little bit about how we thought about Kenzaki and his kind of like role as the villain in the whole series, and then we also talked about how the series is like 80s from its core. Like you look at this and it's like almost like a time capsule of the 80s presented to you in like the visuals and the insert songs. There's one that plays towards the end that's really great. It's got like I think it's called like Dogfight, and I don't know, all the songs perfectly fit in my opinion.
Yeah, I guess the soundtrack is something to touch on. I mean, to me, the soundtrack was kind of weird. Not necessarily just like the music itself, but like how it's used was kind of strange because in sometimes there would just be like no music at all for like a really long stretch of time. It felt kind of like sporadic when the music comes in,
I can get
partially
that.
because I'm used to like you look at more modern shows. I mean, even going into like the 90s, um music used in film and television just all throughout gets progressively like more frequent in how they use music to like accent the varying emotions of from scene to scene. And I mean nowadays you look at a show and if there isn't music, that's when it's like surprising. That's like the striking moment is when they cut the music out and it's just silence.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the average length of an OST nowadays, and it's like 30 songs, and they're all like, snippets, and they all sound extremely different from one another.
Whereas this is sort of like one style.
Mm-hmm.
I while I generally like the soundtrack as a whole, my only like issue was I felt like it kind of undermines the emotions a little bit because it's cool music. It's like it's music you listen to and you're like, yeah, I feel cool. I'm jamming to this. Whereas like the scene itself oftentimes is pretty dramatic and not really I wouldn't describe the emotions behind the scene like at least in the context of the characters as cool because like we're watching Kazuma mow down these guys and we know he like hates doing this and he knows that it's like not the right thing to do
And
and
they're
he's
they're
not
playing
really.
like 80s karaoke music.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get that.
It feels a little bit of a disconnect. I mean, even I feel that a little bit with like the presentation because they're like showing off these wicked angles as like they get blown up, and um it felt a little strange as cool as it is, for me in the because of the story behind it, like the character behind it, it felt a little wrong.
I get it. It's almost like voyeuristic in a way. Like, we're supposed to not feel good because this is the loss of life, but it's presented in a way where you say like, oh, cool explosion, even though there's like a person with a family that is being torn to smithereens. Although they do kind of like focus in on it sometimes. Like, I remember they were hamming it up when Boris dies in the beginning, where he's just
Yeah.
like, like he's like riddled with bullets and there's blood just pouring out of him, and
Oh yeah, it gets pretty gruesome.
yeah.
Or I mean another pretty dramatic scene is like we brought up earlier, but when that guy is hanging from the enemy jumps out, uses his escape parachute, and Kazuma is like, no, don't shoot him down, like he's defenseless. It's no longer he's no longer a target. That was a pretty powerful the when the emotional stakes were high.
Yeah, definitely. Also, I think that moment is a really important thing to look at Kazuma's character as well, because we throughout the show we see Kazuma as kind of this like innocent. He's just trying to get by the situation he finds himself in, but then he does that surprising decision at the end, and I think there's a little bit of foreshadowing when he's talking to Win, the Vietnamese pilot, and he's telling him how yes, you shouldn't shoot down defenseless people, but it's also a waste of ammo.
Mm-hmm.
It's just showing that he can think about it in those two ways.
Yeah. Well, I think for that scene in particular, it was more an expression of not necessarily just like meant to be taken literally, but like an expression of his like acknowledging some sort of camaraderie with the guy,
Mm-hmm.
because it's like the whole time he's like we'll be friends, we'll be buddies, because like he's like, I get you, I understand you, I'm like you, and Kazuma either like disagrees or just doesn't want to accept it, and finally towards the end he like gives him some acknowledgement, at least perhaps in a way of understanding that they are somewhat alike.
Yeah.
Um, Before we get into the ending, because I have a lot of opinions on the ending, and I think it will be difficult to pull things back once we start talking about the last the like ending scenes and stuff, like what goes on at the climax and all. I wanted to like just touch briefly on the love interest, because she sort of has her a smaller arc underneath the main story of Kazuma going on, that's actually pretty interesting. Ryoko.
Yeah, I like her. She is, inherently a little simplistic, just because we don't really get much screen time of her. They show her briefly at the beginning when he's like reminiscing, and we know that they fell in love and blah blah blah. And she's the daughter of a big airplane company. Um, but most of her arc is just boiling down to her trying to find Kazuma and not giving up hope, and then doing everything she can to find him and bring him home.
Yeah. It felt a little strange that, I mean, towards this is more towards the end, but she finds out that Kazuma is alive and that he's on the front lines at Area 88, and she's trying to do everything she can to get to him, but not only is it like difficult because that area is a literal war zone that's like the government is like falling apart. She's also being impeded because what's his name, the main antagonist,
Kanzaki.
Kanzaki, that's right, how could I forget, he doesn't want her to do that because he is clearly in love with her and hates the fact that she still loves Kazuma even now after all this time. And there's particularly like there's this growing tension where eventually Kanzaki is kind of like, he's like, if you let me have my way with you, then I'll buy the stock, the airline stock at full price so that you can like buy Kazuma's freedom. That doesn't go anywhere. Like they're building up and then it like stops before it gets to like the actual like point of tension, because her assistant comes in with the police and has him apprehended, and it sort of felt like she never really finished her arc. Like her whole arc was like trying to help save Kanzaki, and in the end, none of her actions actually do anything to help Kanzaki. None of her actions actually do anything to help Kazuma.
Yeah, but I think the point was more like the lengths she was willing to go to, because like when that happens, she's actually like in the shower undressing.
Mm-hmm.
But then I like how she asks herself, like, if I do this, would Kazuma would he understand? Would he take me back?
Right.
But you're right that her arc doesn't really have a definitive like conclusive ending.
Neither does this OVA.
Yeah.
Oof. Kanzaki. There's a subject, the greatest segue ever. He's a character. It's interesting because on his part, he's like halfway between like a bad guy, but like a guy who's like troubled still, and then just straight out evil villain type of character. Particularly it feels like he like transitions from just regular like troubled bad guy to evil villain over the course, because at first he's like he does this because he's so like bitter over the fact that Kazuma has everything that he wants, and he's like always second place to Kazuma. And then even later on there's a scene where he's like, did I really do what was best? Like he's sort of having some regrets over his actions. But then like later on it's like he progressively gets more and more sort of like just into this whole like evil character. Like, I mean, even the scene where he's giving his ultimatum to Ryoko. He does like an evil laugh, like a straight up just like evil
Yeah.
laugh.
He actually does that multiple times. I
Yeah.
always laughed so hard every time I heard it.
And then even when he finally gets caught, and it's like his entire plan is sort of just crumbling around him. He's like, I guess the fireworks are over. Like he just sort of accepts, like, I failed. Like the fun part, the fireworks have come to an end.
Yeah.
Um,
I thought he was actually gonna jump, like try to commit
Me
suicide.
too. I thought so too. I thought the same thing, and it would have been pretty in character with like the OVAs as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah, but I was talking to Shapes about how he's pretty much kind of one dimensional. Like he's a very simplistic villain. Because even though he does have motivations, like I hate villains that are evil just for the sake of being evil, but he does have reasons. He's greedy and he wants everything that Cosma has, that feels that he deserves. But in the end, he's just okay for me. I mean, he's
Yeah.
almost cartoonishly evil towards the end. But oh, let's use
That's how I feel.
airplanes that are defected.
Yeah, his falling did definitely feel like, and this is sort of an issue I have, a general issue, is where certain actions have consequences, but we never see the actions that lead to the consequences. Like he chooses to use these cheaper planes, and we are given an expository scene that sort of shows that tells us that he chose to use these cheaper planes that would probably break down. But I feel like it would have been like more effective if we actually like see him making the decision to use planes of lower costs and like other stuff like that, where we sort of see his rise a bit more, and how everything seems so fine and dandy for him, and it doesn't seem like anything could go wrong. And then when everything starts falling apart around him, it's more like more effective.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
But I guess it's time to talk a little bit about the ending, which I found pretty strange, actually, particularly just like the third OVA as a whole. Because Shades mentioned it earlier. He watched it and the first and second episode of the OVA were like joined together, and that was for me too. I mean, I watched it on YouTube because why not? It was there. And the first and second episode are joined, so I watched them together, and then I watched the third episode. And the third episode feels very sort of different from the first and second in a lot of ways. Particularly, it just feels like the pace suddenly like picks up to go at like breakneck speed. They're like, okay, we need to touch on this and this theme, and we need to have the characters go here and here and do this and that. To the point that it felt a little like some of the emotions of certain scenes were not as powerful as they could have been.
Yeah, I would say I agree. Like one of the big things about watching the third episode is that I didn't really feel a clear climax. Like things just kind of happen, and then he goes back to Paris, and I was still like at that point I was still waiting. Like, is there going to be one last big fight? Because it doesn't feel like we should be in the falling action yet. And then when the ending happened, I was like, okay.
And even the ending is a bit, like, at least for me, and that's part of the feeling where it feels kind of rushed, because like, okay, so he gets to Paris and he's there literally a day, and then he's like, okay, I have to go back. He's just like literally there a day. He's spent like, I mean, I understand the themes they were going for, and like that's the thing, like they set it up well. Like not only do they reflect what Kazuma goes through in Mickey, who like basically foreshadows these events, but like you get the idea from when Mickey's telling it, like he went to the world and he tried to live like a real life, and he just couldn't do it. Like, but he put in the effort. It wasn't just like he showed up and he was like, I can't do this, I'm going back.
Yeah.
And then then so he's like there literally a day, and then he gets asked to leave because like he kills, or not, doesn't kill, but he apprehends essentially these guys who are robbing a bank.
Which feels
And they're
very
like,
contrived, by the way.
yeah, that was a amusing scene. Um, I mean, I didn't have too big a problem with it. Maybe they went a little over the top with the presentation, but I feel like in general it goes a little bit more towards like the over the top action, so it's not too out of what it is already does. But it's like the my big issue that like really like hurt the movie for me was just like, not only does he decide to go back to Area 88, which is immediately undermined by the fact that as he comes back, the government has collapsed and they are surrendering. And
Yeah.
his leader just tells him, yeah, you guys need to run. Like, you guys are all excused from duty. Go out in your planes and run. So he literally like comes back to be told, leave. And they don't even show the scene of him like arriving back and the reaction of his crew. Like, they just go straight to the scene of him taking off in the plane to go out into the sky. And they never show him meeting Ryoko, which was like, I felt like that was the entire buildup of all 3 episodes was just to see him and Ryoko finally meet, and we never see it. That was like, oh my goodness, like how could you do this? How could you seriously never not have them meet? It was painful.
I mean, like, you're right that it does set this up and foreshadow it pretty early on in the OVAs, and I feel like it's kind of the point, because he feels like if he ever does meet Ryoko, he's gonna have a harder time balancing this life where he has this thirst and you know where he actually wants to be. And I thought it was really cool how they, you know, kind of paralleled that, because at the end of the second OVA, he's lost in the desert, and eventually he finds his way back to not somewhere else, but back to Area 88.
Mm-hmm.
And combine that with the thirst imagery, it's remarkably similar. It's kind of a commentary on the fact that war changes you as a person, to the point where you can't be in normal company anymore. And I think that was kind of a poignant thought.
Yeah. I mean that's in the thing is like, I think like the themes, the material, the thematic material it's getting at is worth considering, but like, I mean, those events that I just described happened over the course of like 20 minutes.
Yeah, no, that was a little.
So that was like my problem is we know like the theme is war changes people, but you know, Kazuma didn't seem all that different to me, to be honest, from how he was like in the first episode, where he was like very clearly passionate for Ryoko and still completely hated killing. Like, there were a couple scenes where he's like, I mean, the biggest moment that does help it is the moment where he has to shoot down his comrade, who's like got shot in the eyes and he's blind and is like just a liability, and he says he doesn't feel anything, and that I think is like a strong point, like in favor of the ending and showing that he has been sort of destroyed by this life he's led. But I do still feel like we could have had a lot more looking into the time of him trying to fit into the real world and failing, and more of him like thinking about like, can I really be with Ryoko? Like do I just have like this idealized image of how things will be, or am I really like that different that it wouldn't work?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Because, like, they try to do it briefly in the last 20 minutes where they show him just kind of, like, passively, depressingly walking through the streets of Paris at the different, like, landmarks. And then right when he is actually able to get into a fight, that's when he, like, his face perks up and he's, like, in the mood.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, too short. Too late.
But overall, it was a fun time. I definitely enjoyed it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I would say so too.
I
I'm glad I
happen
watched
to, I
it.
happen to like it
Oh.
too. Sorry. Yeah. I wanted to mention with the OVA about the ending in particular. A really interesting fact that it every iteration of Area 88 ends differently. So the manga
Huh.
has its own ending. The OVA has its ending, which is left very open ended and kind of on like a little bit of a cliffhanger. And then the TV series has its own ending. And I mean, I haven't personally experienced the other two, but from what I've read about the other two, I really like the idea of not knowing what happens to him at the end when he's flying away and probably off to his death or something. But you don't know what happens to him. I don't know. I think the way it leaves it open ended makes a pretty strong statement to the end. Even if the lead up to that ending is a little haphazard, which I do agree with your criticisms of it, Core.
Yeah. I mean, I might go check out the manga now just to see where it takes it. Because I'm pretty interested to see an alternate take on the ending.
Hmm.
Um,
And then you do have a
since I
12 episode series too. I mean, I know it looks
yeah.
kind of bland, but I mean, if you wanted more of like maybe fleshed out in terms of a complete story for 12 episodes, maybe it's a little more satisfying. I'm not 100%.
I mean, it's not actually like that much longer. I mean, the OVAs, there's three of them. It's like 3 hours long, right?
No,
Um,
I didn't think they were an hour each.
No, they're
that's what
pretty long.
that's what Mal has listed, 1 hour and 5 minutes an episode.
Huh. I don't even remember that.
Um,
Well,
and
that's
it's
fair.
like a 12 episode anime, so
It's like
it's
it's
really
like about
only
4 or
like
5
an extra
hours.
hour
Yeah, definitely. Then you also have
if you
like
cut out like
the
the
aesthetic
openings.
difference of having to series compositions, having to like how much can you put in this episode versus how much you put in this
Right.
episode, whereas the pacing could probably just be way different.
I'm curious. So was this actually? I mean, I guess I can just look. It ended in 1986. Okay, and the manga ended in 1986. So, I'm assuming that like the manga was complete when. Well, actually, maybe not, because if the manga ended in 1986, this definitely would have been in production before then.
Yeah.
So I wonder if it was like they sort of ended it a bit open ended because there wasn't like the final like chapters hadn't been published yet.
That may have been the case, yeah. I wouldn't put it past them.
But it was like a pretty solid time. Definitely very. It's got a good, just like sort of completeness to it, despite like the open endedness of the
Yeah,
ending.
it's
It
definitely
just
its own
feels
package.
like
I agree.
it has like a pretty natural flow to it.
Yeah, I'd say so. You could argue that the releasing him from his contract is a little kind of disjointed.
Yeah. It felt kind of like it undermined his return. Like at least for me, like I would have been more okay with his coming back if it was like he comes back and then they're like we're going to do like one last battle, and then it ends as like they basically set out on a suicide mission
Yeah, that was expecting to
instead
happen,
of them
actually.
just like running away. Like that's what they're literally doing. Which felt like it was a bit like this isn't as like grand as you're making it out to be. So anyone have some final thoughts to bring things around?
Very recommendable. Very important OVA if you like OVAs, if you like war dramas. It's one of the best out there, I would say.
I'd agree. Got some great flight action choreography, well drawn, hand drawn explosions, and a good story to boot. So
Yeah, I would definitely recommend giving it a watch. I personally like it's not quite the like my style of show that I like usually watch, but especially if you are more into something heavily into like that into action and like war dramas and that type of stuff, definitely would be right up your alley, and it's got some really, really beautiful animation as well, supporting it all, so would recommend. Alright, so thank you all for watching. Once again, I've been joined by Kamimashita,
Bye-bye.
Shaves,
See you around, guys.
and myself, Core. I'll see you all next time.